The chest had sat in the corner of Gideon Granger's bedroom for 10 years, 3 months, and an indeterminate number of days, gathering a fine coat of New Mexico dust and a reputation among the few people who had ever set foot inside his home as the one thing you simply did not ask about. It was made of cedar, the kind that held its scent long after everything else had faded, and it was banded with iron that had gone rust-orange at the hinges. There was a small brass lock on the front, but Gideon had not locked it. He had simply not opened it, which was a different kind of keeping something shut, the kind that had nothing to do with keys and everything to do with the particular weight a man carries when he has lost someone he was not ready to lose. Maria Shelton arrived in the town of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, on the 4th day of April in 1878, on a stage coach that had lost a wheel somewhere outside of Raton, and arrived 3 hours late and considerably more battered than its passengers had anticipated. She stepped down from that coach with a carpetbag in one hand and a leather satchel worn soft from years of use over her other shoulder, and she looked at the main street of Cimarron with the kind of steady gaze that suggested she had seen towns like this before and had made up her mind to find something worth staying for. She was 26 years old, with dark hair she kept pinned up beneath a traveling hat that had seen better days, and eyes the color of strong coffee, warm and clear, and carrying something in them that made people feel, when she looked at them directly, that they had been genuinely seen. She had come from Santa Fe, where she had spent the last 2 years working as a schoolteacher, and before that from a small farm outside of Taos, where she had grown up the eldest of 5 children, the kind of eldest child who learned early that love meant paying attention, that caring for people was not a burden but a calling, and that there was a particular grace in noticing what other people overlooked. She had a letter in her satchel, written in careful block letters by a woman named Clara Bridwell, who ran the dry goods store on Cimarron's Main Street, and had written to the Territorial Education Board asking for a schoolteacher for the coming year because their last one, a Mr. Hodgkins, had married a rancher's daughter and followed her back to her family's land in Colorado and never returned. The letter had found its way to Maria through a chain of correspondence that had taken nearly 4 months, and she had accepted the position because she was ready for something new, and because Cimarron was the kind of place, based on everything she had read and heard, that needed someone willing to pay attention. Clara Bridwell was a stout woman in her 50s with silver hair, and the particular competence of someone who had built a business from scratch in a place where nothing was given freely. She met Maria at the stage stop herself, having watched for the stage from her doorway with the patience of a woman accustomed to things arriving late. "Miss Shelton," she said, extending a hand that was roughened from years of work. "You made it. I was beginning to worry." "Lost a wheel outside Raton," Maria said, shaking the woman's hand with a firm grip. "But here I am." "Here you are indeed," Clara said, and something in her voice suggested she was pleased by what she saw. "Come along then. I have a room above the store that's yours through the end of the school year, and there's supper waiting if you're hungry." "I am very hungry," Maria said honestly, and Clara laughed, and that was how it started. Cimarron in 1878 was a town that had been through more than most. It sat in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains at the edge of the Cimarron Range, and it had the particular history of a place where land disputes had left their mark on nearly every family. The Maxwell land grant controversy had torn through the region like a slow-burning fire for years, and while things had settled into a kind of uneasy quiet by the time Maria arrived, there was still an edge to the town, a wariness in the eyes of the ranchers, a certain tension between those who had staked their claims and those who had been pushed off land they believed was rightfully theirs. Maria noticed it in the careful way people spoke about property, in the gaps in conversation when certain names came up, and she filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered. Gideon Granger was the first person Clara mentioned who she should know. He runs the livery on the north end of town, Clara said over supper that first evening, setting a bowl of stew in front of Maria that smelled of chili peppers and slow-cooked beef. Has done for going on 6 years now. Good man, honest in his dealings. Keeps mostly to himself since his father passed, but he's the one to go to if you need a horse or a wagon, and he's on the school committee, so you'll meet him soon enough. He doesn't say much in committee meetings, but when he does speak, people listen. How long ago did his father pass? Maria asked, because she was the kind of person who asked follow-up questions. Clara set down her own bowl and thought about it. Oh, it'll be 10 years this coming summer. Thomas Granger. Good man Thomas was. Gideon was just 19 when it happened. The ranch went to debt shortly after land grant trouble, same as hit half the valley. Gideon sold the land, kept what he could, and built himself up from nothing. Takes a certain kind of man to do that. It does, Maria agreed, and she thought about it for a moment, a 19-year-old boy watching everything his father had built slip away. And then she set the thought aside, because she had a meal to finish and a new life to begin. She met Gideon Granger 3 days later, at the first school committee meeting, which was held in the back room of the town's small courthouse. He was taller than she had expected from Clara's matter-of-fact description, broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked with their hands every day, with dark hair that needed a cut and a jaw that carried about a week's worth of beard. He wore a plain work shirt and leather vest, and his boots were clean despite his work. He sat at the far end of the table with his hat in his lap and watched her with dark eyes that were cautious but not unfriendly, and when she was introduced to each committee member in turn and reached him, he stood, which not all of the men did, and shook her hand with a grip that was careful not to be too strong. "Miss Shelton," he said, "welcome to Cimarron." "Mr. Granger," she said, "thank you." His voice was quiet and direct. She noticed that he was probably around 29, perhaps 30, with the kind of stillness about him that came from years of learning to hold things in rather than let them out. She noticed a small scar along his left forearm where his sleeve was rolled up, and the way he sat with his back very straight, and the way he watched the other men at the table without contributing, unless something was actually worth contributing, which she would come to understand, was one of his more endearing qualities. The meeting was primarily about the schoolhouse, which needed a new roof on the east side before the summer rains came, and about the purchase of new primers, and about the question of whether children from the ranches along the western ridge could be transported in twice a week on a donated wagon. Gideon spoke once, clearly and without hedging, to say that he would donate the use of a wagon and a reliable horse for the transport arrangement, and that was the end of the discussion on that point. Afterward, as people filed out into the cool April evening, Maria found herself standing near him at the door while the committee chairman, a verbose man named Harold Tuck, held everyone up with a final lengthy observation about the condition of the schoolhouse chimney. "Does he always talk this long?" she asked quietly, not looking at Gideon, her eyes fixed politely forward. There was a pause, and then Gideon said, also quietly and also not looking at her, "In my experience, yes." She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling too openly. When Harold Tuck finally wound down and people moved out onto the boardwalk, she glanced at Gideon and found that he was looking at her with something that might, on a more demonstrative man, have been the beginning of a smile. "Good evening, Miss Shelton," he said, settling his hat on his head. "Good evening, Mr. Granger," she said. He walked off down the street toward the north end of town, and she watched him for a moment before turning in the direction of Clara's store, and she thought that Clara had been right. There was something about Gideon Granger that made you want to look closer. The school year began in earnest the following Monday, and Maria found her footing quickly. She had 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, children from in town and from the ranches, some who had been educated before and some who had not, and she settled into the work of teaching them with the focused pleasure of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do. She set up the schoolroom so that the light came in properly from the south-facing windows, made sure the stove was functional before the temperature dropped, and spent her first 2 evenings writing lesson plans by lamplight in her room above Clara's store. She saw Gideon with some regularity, as Clara's store was not far from the livery and the main street was not long. She saw him in the mornings when he led horses to the water trough on the street's edge, moving with the unhurried competence of a man who had been working with animals since childhood. She saw him on Sundays at the small church at the far end of town, sitting in the third pew from the back, hat in his lap, listening with the same watchful attention he brought to everything. She saw him at the general store and at the post office window and at the occasional town gathering, and they always exchanged a greeting, and the greetings grew gradually warmer as the weeks went on. It was Clara who first told her about the chest. She had not asked. They were sitting at the small table in Clara's kitchen one evening in late April, Clara mending a shirt and Maria grading arithmetic papers, and the conversation had moved in the comfortable wandering way that conversations between women often do. They had been talking about the Granger ranch, which had come up because one of Maria's students, a quiet boy named Ellis Granger, who was Gideon's cousin's son, had written an arithmetic problem involving cattle and had mentioned in passing that his family used to own a great deal more land before the Grant trouble. Gideon's father built that ranch up over 20 years, Clara said, her needle working steadily through the shirt. Thomas Granger was the kind of man who believed in the land the way some people believe in God, had a deep, patient love for it, and he had all sorts of things, collected things, kept things. He was a reader, Thomas was, which was not so common among ranchers in those days, had books and maps and all manner of correspondence stored away. When he died, Gideon packed up a wooden chest, Thomas's chest, the one he kept in his study, and he brought it with him when he left the ranch. And as far as anyone has ever been able to tell, he has not opened it since. Maria's pen had stilled on the paper beneath it. Not once in 10 years. Not once, Clara confirmed. I asked him about it once, about 5 years back, gently as I could. He just said there were some things that needed time and left it at that, and I knew better than to push. She paused in her mending. The boy carries his grief quietly, Maria, always has. He was raised that way. Thomas was a good man, but not one for speaking feelings out loud. Gideon learned to hold things. It serves him in some ways and costs him in others. Maria set down her pen and looked at the lamp flame for a moment. She was not the kind of woman who looked for broken things to fix. She had learned long ago that there was a difference between caring for someone and trying to change them, and that the best thing you could do for a person who carried something heavy was not to take it from them without their permission, but to stand close enough that they knew they did not have to carry it entirely alone. He must have loved his father very much, she said. He did, Clara said simply. And Thomas loved him. That's what makes the closed chest so hard to look at, I think. Everything that man was, his words, his ideas, his life, is in that chest, and Gideon has not been able to face it. She picked up her pen again and went back to the arithmetic papers, but the image of it stayed with her. A cedar chest in the corner of a quiet room, full of a man's whole life, and his son not ready to open it. The spring deepened into warmth, and Maria found her place in Cimarron with the naturalness of someone who had been paying attention to what was needed. She knew the names of all her students within the first week, and the names of their parents and siblings within the second, and she knew which families were struggling, and which children came to school hungry, and she kept extra biscuits in her desk drawer without making it a matter of charity, just setting them out mid-morning as something she did for everyone. She organized a spelling competition at the end of April and invited the whole town to watch, and Harold Tuck gave a speech that went on too long before it and an equally long speech after, and the children glowed with the particular pride of having performed in front of their families. Gideon attended. She had not expected to be particularly aware of whether he did or not, but she found herself noting his presence near the back of the room with a quiet recognition that she did not entirely examine. He stayed to the end, and when the crowd dispersed he approached her, which was unusual, because in her experience Gideon Granger rarely approached people, preferring to be approached, and said, "You've done something with them. They were proud of themselves out there." "They worked hard," she said, still flushed with the warmth of the evening. "Children always surprise you if you give them something real to aim at." He looked at her for a moment with that careful, considering expression she was beginning to recognize. "I don't think Mr. Hodgkins ever held a spelling competition," he said. "Mr. Hodgkins," she said, "followed his heart to Colorado, which I cannot fault him for, but it does seem he may have missed some opportunities before he left." There it was again, that careful, not quite smile. "Good evening, Miss Shelton," he said. "Good evening, Mr. Granger," she said. But that night, sitting at the window of her room with the mountain air coming cool through the open glass, she thought about the way he had looked at her, not with the frank appraisal some men offered, which she had learned long ago to field without flinching, but with something more like attentiveness, as though he was genuinely trying to understand what he was seeing, as though she was a thing worth taking time over. She picked up her journal, which she had kept since she was 16, and she wrote, "He is a careful man. More careful than most. I think he has been hurt by careless things." Then she closed the journal and went to sleep. In May, a dispute arose between two ranching families on the western edge of the valley over the use of a shared water source, and it escalated with the particular speed of things that had been building for a long time beneath a surface of maintained politeness. One of the families, the Holloways, had 2 children in Maria's school, and the other, the Beaumont family, had 1. She watched the tension filter down into the schoolroom, the way it always did when adult troubles had nowhere else to go, and she handled it with the quiet steadiness she had learned from years of paying attention. What she had not counted on was the night the dispute threatened to become something uglier. She was walking back from the Bridwell store late one evening in May, the long twilight of the New Mexico spring still holding some color at the horizon, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the livery. She did not make it a practice to involve herself in other people's conflicts, but the voices were sharp with the specific quality of things about to go wrong, and she walked in that direction because she could not do otherwise. What she found was Gideon Granger standing between 2 men. She recognized them as Holloway Sr. and Beaumont Sr., both red-faced and both with the kind of stiff posture that meant hands were thinking about going for something they should not go for. Gideon was speaking in a low, level voice that she could not hear from where she stood at the edge of the livery yard, but whatever he was saying was having an effect, because Holloway took a step back, and then Beaumont took a step back, and the quality of the air shifted from sharp to merely angry, which was a significant improvement. She stood at the fence and watched. Gideon said something more, and both men looked at the ground, and then they nodded separately, and then they walked off in opposite directions without speaking to each other, and Gideon stood alone in the livery yard with the last light of the evening behind him and his hands loose at his sides. He turned and saw her. For a moment neither of them said anything. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said. He walked toward her with a measured pace. "The water dispute, it's been building." "I know," she said. "I see it in the children." He stopped a few feet from her, and she could see in the fading light that he looked tired in a way that was more than the tiredness of a long day. "Both men are afraid," he said. "Fear makes people stupid. I just reminded them that shooting each other over a water source would solve exactly nothing and leave their children fatherless, and that there is a county judge in Springer who handles water rights disputes and who they should be speaking to." "That was well done," she said. He looked at her with something careful and warm. "I have 2 of their children's horses here," he said, as if that explained everything. "I have a vested interest in their father's staying alive." She found herself smiling. "That is a very practical form of peacemaking. Most of the best kinds are," he said. And then, surprising her, "Would you like to see something?" She looked at him. In all the weeks since she had arrived, they had always spoken briefly and gone their separate ways. This was different. She said, "Yes." He led her into the livery, which smelled of hay and warm horse and leather, the comfortable deep smell of a well-kept stable. 3 horses shifted and breathed in their stalls, and at the end of the row was a fourth, a small bay mare with a foal, newly arrived it seemed, the foal still unsteady on its legs, all loose joints and enormous eyes. "Born this afternoon," Gideon said quietly. He leaned on the stall door and watched them. "I forgot to go home for supper." Maria stood beside him at the stall and looked at the foal, who was butting uncertainly against its mother with the magnificent clumsiness of something that had only recently discovered it had legs. Something opened in her chest, the warm spreading feeling that came from looking at things that were alive and new and entirely unaware of being watched. "What will you name her?" she asked. "I leave naming to the owners," he said. "This one belongs to Clara, technically. Her old mare finally came through." "Clara will name her something sensible," Maria said. "Like Prudence," he laughed. It was quiet, but it was real, and the sound of it startled her slightly because she had not heard him laugh before, and it was a better sound than she had expected, low and genuine, a sound that came from somewhere he usually kept covered. "Probably," he agreed. They stood together for a while watching the mare and foal, not talking, and it was one of the most comfortable silences Maria had experienced in a long time. The livery was quiet around them, and the evening air came through the open stable doors, and somewhere outside a nighthawk was calling, and she was aware of him beside her, his steadiness, the warmth that came off him in the cooling air, and she thought that this was a moment worth remembering, and she filed it away carefully. "Thank you for showing me," she said at last. "Thank you for not running off when you heard the trouble," he said. "I wasn't going to run off," she said, surprised. "No," he said, looking at her. "I didn't think you were." She walked home in the full dark, the stars enormous over the mountains, and she did not write anything in her journal that night. Some things, she had learned, settled better if you simply let them rest. June came, and with it the end of the school year, and a different kind of heat that settled over the valley like something that had been waiting all spring to arrive. Maria had agreed to stay on for the summer. There were children who could benefit from continued lessons, and Clara had offered her room at a reduced rate. And the honest truth was that Cimarron had become, in the span of 2 months, the kind of place she did not want to leave yet, though she would not have said so out loud. She and Gideon had fallen into something that was not quite a courtship, but was clearly more than neighborly acquaintance. He came by the school at the end of days when he was passing and occasionally stayed to help her move furniture or fix something that needed fixing. She brought supper to the livery twice when she had made too much, and they ate together in the relative cool of the stable, with the horses companionable in their stalls, and the conversation that moved between them with the increasing ease of people learning each other's rhythms. She learned that he read when he could, which surprised her, and then did not. His father had been a reader, and Gideon had inherited the habit, keeping a small shelf of books in his room above the livery that he had collected over the years. He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher since she was 10 years old, when a traveling schoolmistress had stopped in Taos for 3 weeks and had opened a temporary school in the back of the church, and Maria had sat in the front row every single day. He told her about the livery with the quiet pride of a man who had built something from scratch. He had come to Cimarron at 23 with very little, and had worked for 3 years at the existing livery, before the owner retired, and sold the business to him at a price that was fair because the man believed in Gideon's ability to do right by the horses. He had rebuilt the stalls, expanded the paddock, and established himself as a man who could be trusted with other people's animals, which in a ranching territory was no small thing. She noticed that he never mentioned his father unless she brought the subject up, and when she did he answered briefly and moved on, and she let him. She was not in a hurry. She had learned from a young age that trust was not something you demanded from people. It was something you built by showing up consistently, and she intended to show up consistently. The chest came up indirectly in the middle of June, during a Sunday afternoon when she had been invited to the small celebration for Ellis Granger's birthday at his parents' home on the edge of town. Gideon was there, and afterward they walked back toward town together in the late afternoon heat, and Ellis's mother, a kind, tired woman named Ruth, had mentioned in passing the Granger family's reading tradition, which had apparently been a thing of note. Thomas Granger used to correspond with people all over the country, Ruth had said, her voice carrying the particular fondness of someone speaking about a time that was gone. Philosophers, I think, and scientists and all sorts. He had a whole life of letters in that chest of his. It was something to see. Gideon had said nothing, but Maria had felt the stillness come over him, the particular quality of stillness that was different from his normal quietness, tighter, more guarded. Walking back along the dusty road with the mountains enormous and gold in the afternoon light, she said, carefully, "Your father sounds like he was an extraordinary man." Gideon was quiet for several steps. "He was," he said finally. "Do you take after him?" Another pause, longer this time. "Ruth thinks I do. I think I take after him in the ways that matter less and miss the ways that matter more." "What does that mean?" He stopped walking, which surprised her. She stopped too and turned to look at him, and there was something in his expression she had not seen before, something raw and honest, as if the question had caught him without his guard up. "He was good at letting people in," Gideon said. "That's the way that mattered most. I'm not as good at that." Maria looked at him for a moment and thought about all the ways she could respond, and chose the simplest one. "You are better at it than you think," she said. "You let me watch the foal being born." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something shifted in his expression, not quite the not quite smile, but something deeper and warmer and more vulnerable, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing that was underneath all along. "I suppose I did," he said. They walked on, and neither of them said anything else about it, but the conversation had moved something, and they both knew it. It was Clara who told her, a week later, that Gideon had asked Clara whether Maria had any plans to leave Cimarron at the end of the summer. "What did you tell him?" Maria asked, looking up from her mending. "I told him that was a question he should be asking you himself," Clara said serenely, and went back to her account books. He asked her 2 days later in the early evening of a Tuesday, finding her on the boardwalk outside the school locking the door. The sun was low and red gold over the mountains, and the air smelled of pine resin from the hills, and the day's collected dust. He came down the street with the unhurried walk of a man who had decided to do something and was not going to agonize over it. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, stopping at the bottom of the 2 steps that led up to the school door. "All right," she said, turning to face him with the key in her hand. "Clara tells me you're thinking about staying on through the winter." "I have not decided yet," she said, which was not entirely true, but she wanted to hear what he was going to say. He looked at the hat brim he was holding in his hands, and then he looked up at her, and the directness of his gaze was something she always had to be a little ready for, because it was more honest than most people's. "I would like you to stay," he said. "I know that's not my decision to make. But I wanted you to know that it would matter to me, that you being here matters to me." Maria stood with the school key in her hand and the red gold evening all around them, and she felt something settle in her the way things settled when they found their right place. She had lived 26 years and learned to recognize the difference between attraction and something that ran deeper, and what she felt when she looked at Gideon Granger was the second kind, a recognition, a rightness, a sense of someone worth building toward. "I am going to stay," she said. "I was already going to stay. I just wanted to hear you say it." A real smile then. Not the careful almost smile, but an actual open smile that changed his whole face, and she thought she had never seen him look quite that young before, and it was wonderful. "That is slightly unfair," he said. "I'm a schoolteacher," she said. "We ask questions we already know the answer to. It builds confidence in the respondent." He laughed again, the low, genuine laugh, and shook his head and looked at her with warm, open eyes. "Maria," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name. "Would you have supper with me on Friday, not at the livery, somewhere proper?" "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much, Gideon," the name in her mouth, the evening light around them. He put his hat back on and nodded once, the nod of a man who has accomplished something important, and walked back up the street, and she stood on the school steps for a moment longer than she needed to, looking at the mountains. Their first real supper together was at Cimarron's small dining room, a place run by a Mexican family named Reyes, where the food was exceptional and the tablecloths were white cotton kept clean despite everything. Gideon arrived in a clean shirt and a dark vest, and his boots were polished, and he pulled out her chair, and she wore the dress she had brought from Santa Fe that was the color of deep blue sky, and she had done her hair differently, and she saw the moment he noticed. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about books and about the territory and about their families, and she told him about growing up in Taos and about her 4 younger siblings, and about the particular exhaustion and joy of being the one everyone leaned on. And he told her about growing up on the ranch, and about the way the land had felt like a living thing his father was in conversation with. And somewhere in the second hour, he reached across the table and touched her hand just briefly, just to punctuate something he was saying. And neither of them addressed it directly, but she kept her hand near his on the table for the rest of the evening. Walking home in the warm June night, they stopped at the edge of the plaza and looked up at the stars, which in New Mexico were so abundant they seemed pressed close against the earth. "I am glad you came to Cimarron," he said. "So am I," she said. He was looking at the stars, and then he looked at her, and she thought he might kiss her, and she thought she would like it if he did, but he was a careful man and he was building towards something rather than rushing it, and he simply took her hand and held it for a moment, warm and steady, and then walked her to Clara's door and said good night. She wrote in her journal that night, "He held my hand." He is the kind of man who means it when he does something. July arrived with the particular ferocity that July in New Mexico carries, and life continued with the lovely texture of 2 people falling into each other's orbits. They took walks on Sunday afternoons in the foothills, where the air was cooler and the pinon trees gave shade. They read together sometimes, he with a history of the territory he had acquired from a traveling bookseller, and she with whatever novel she was working through, sitting in the comfortable shade of the livery yard in the late afternoons when the school day was done and the horses were fed. He brought her wildflowers once, awkwardly, presenting them without ceremony as if they were something he had simply found and thought she might want, and she put them in a tin cup of water on her windowsill and looked at them every morning. She met more of his world and he met more of hers, and they moved between their 2 lives with increasing naturalness. She went with him twice to the cattle sales on the South Road, where ranchers brought their stock and Gideon assessed animals for their owners, and did so with a quiet expertise that clearly commanded respect. He came to her summer lessons twice, sat at the back, and afterward told her what he had observed with the precision of someone who had been listening closely, and she valued his observations because they were honest and they were accurate. It was the last Saturday of July when she first saw the chest. He had invited her to supper at his room above the livery, which he had cooked himself beans and salt pork and cornbread, simple and good, and they had eaten at the small table by the window with the evening coming down over the mountains, and afterward she had helped him clear away and wash the plates, and it was while she was turning from the wash basin with a dried plate in her hands that she saw it. It was in the corner of the main room, between the bookshelf and the far wall, half concealed by a saddle that had been laid across it at some point. Not to hide it, she thought, but perhaps to keep from looking at it directly. It was exactly as Clara had described, cedar, iron-banded, with the rust-orange hinges and the small brass lock on the front, and it sat with the weight of something that has been given an enormous amount of space by everyone around it. She set the plate down and did not say anything immediately. He was putting his coat back on. They had been going to go out for an evening walk afterward, and he noticed where she was looking. The stillness came over him, the guarded kind, and for a moment the room was very quiet. She said gently, the gentlest she knew how to say anything, "Is that your father's chest?" He did not move for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." "How long has it been there?" "Since I came to Cimarron," he said. 6 years. She did not ask if he had opened it. She already knew from Clara that he had not in 10 years, and she could see it in the way he was standing, in the space the chest commanded in the room, even under its covering. She looked at him, and she said, still gently, still without pressure, "Will you tell me about him, your father, whatever you'd like to tell me?" It was the right question. She knew it was the right question because it gave him the choice, not asking him to open the chest, not pushing, just inviting him to speak, to share his father with her on his own terms. He stood for a long moment, and then he took his coat back off and hung it on the door hook and sat down in the chair by the window. She sat across from him at the table, and she waited. He told her about Thomas Granger. He told her in the way that a man tells something he has been holding for a very long time, slowly at first, like water working through a blockage, and then more freely as the telling began to do what telling does, which is carry weight that has been born in silence. He told her that Thomas Granger had been born in Tennessee in 1822, the son of a farmer, and had come west as a young man because he believed in something he called the dignity of open land, which meant that a man could plant his feet on ground that belonged to him and build something of his own making. He had come to the New Mexico Territory in 1850, before it was properly organized, and he had done exactly what he came to do, building a ranch on land in the Cimarron Valley through 20 years of patient, difficult work. Thomas Granger had also, his son said with a particular careful pride, been a man who read and thought deeply about the world. He had kept a correspondence with a professor of natural philosophy in Philadelphia, and with a former minister turned naturalist in Ohio, and with a Mexican land surveyor who had become a friend in the early days of the territory. He had kept journals, detailed, thoughtful journals about everything from the weather patterns of the valley to his opinions on the nature of democracy, to observations about the horses he raised and the plants that grew in the creek beds. And he had kept all of it, the letters, the journals, the maps he had drawn, the documents of his land claim, in the cedar chest that sat in his study, and that his son had watched him unlock and relock with the same small brass key every time he needed something from it. Gideon was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When he died, the ranch was already in trouble. The land grant dispute had been building for 2 years, and Thomas had been fighting it through every legal channel he knew. He was 54 years old, which is not old, except that he worked like 3 men for 30 years, and the fight with the grant commissioners aged him more than the work did. He died in his sleep in the summer of 1868. Heart, the doctor said. No warning." Maria listened without interrupting. "I was 19, Gideon said. My mother had already passed when I was 12, so it was just me and the ranch and the debt and the dispute, and I was 19 years old and I had no idea how any of it worked. I packed the chest because I couldn't leave it there, couldn't let it go with the property, because everything of him that mattered was in it. But I couldn't open it either because every time I thought about doing it, it felt like..." He stopped. She waited. "Like the last door," he said. "Like opening it meant admitting he was gone. Not just that he was dead, I knew he was dead, I watched them bury him, but that he was gone. That everything in that chest was all that was left, and once I opened it and read it and saw it, that would be the end of finding new things. The last of him would be counted and finished, and I was not ready for that." The room was very quiet. The evening air moved through the window, and the horses shifted in the stalls below, and somewhere on the street a dog was barking at something and letting it go. Maria said softly, "He does not sound finished to me. He sounds like a man with a great deal to say that you have not heard yet." Gideon looked at her. "I don't mean that to be glib," she said. "I mean you have been carrying the weight of loss for 10 years, and the chest is not the end of him. It's the rest of him, the part you haven't met yet." He was looking at her with an expression she did not have a name for, yet something wide open and raw and tender, the face of a man who has been spoken to in exactly the right language after years of not hearing it. "Are you willing to open it?" she asked. "Not right now if you're not ready, but are you willing to think about it?" He looked at the chest in the corner for a long moment, then he looked back at her. "With you here?" he asked. "Maybe. Whenever you're ready," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He reached across the table and took her hand, and this time he held it and did not let go, and they sat together in the quiet room with his father's chest in the corner, and the stars coming out over the mountains, and something that had been locked for 10 years began, very slowly, to loosen. He did not open the chest that evening. He was not ready, and she had not pushed, and after a while they went for their walk and talked about other things, and the conversation had the particular warmth of people who have shared something real with each other and have come out the other side still standing. But 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, he came to the school after she had finished for the day and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "If you're not busy." She put her papers in her satchel and looked at him. "I'm not busy," she said. They walked together to the livery and up the stairs to his room, and the evening light was long and gold through the window, and he moved the saddle from the top of the chest and set it aside, and then he stood and looked at the chest for a moment, and Maria sat in the chair by the table and said nothing. He knelt down in front of it. He was still for a moment. Then he reached into the collar of his shirt and drew out a small brass key on a length of cord that he wore around his neck, which she had not known was there, and he put it into the lock, and he turned it, and the lock opened with a sound that was very small in the quiet room. He lifted the lid. The smell of cedar came out first, strong and clean, the same cedar that had been holding its breath for a decade. Beneath that was the smell of old paper, the dry, slightly dusty smell of pages that have not been turned in a long time. He sat back on his heels and looked at what was inside without touching it for a moment. Maria waited. She could see from where she sat that the chest was full papers and journals, and what looked like a folded map at the top, and beneath those the spines of 2 or 3 small books. Gideon reached in and picked up the folded map first, carefully, as if it might crumble, but it was good paper and it held. He unfolded it, and she could see it was a hand-drawn map of the Cimarron Valley, detailed and precise, with property lines and water sources and trail routes all marked in a steady, careful hand. "He drew this," Gideon said. "He drew maps of everything he surveyed. He said that knowing the land meant being able to draw it from memory, and that if you could do that, you truly knew it." "He was right," Maria said quietly. Gideon refolded the map carefully and set it on the table. He reached into the chest again and brought out one of the journals, a small, leather-bound book with a clasp on the front. He undid the clasp and opened it and read the first line silently, and something moved across his face that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but something that held both. "Would you read it aloud?" she asked, very gently. He looked at her. He looked down at the journal. He began to read. Thomas Granger's journal entries were exactly what Gideon had described, detailed and thoughtful and personal, written in a hand that was neat and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who took words seriously. The entry he had opened to was dated June 12, 1867, a year before Thomas died, and it was about the morning, a specific summer morning, when Thomas had ridden out to the north section of the ranch before sunrise to check on the herd, and had stopped at the top of a ridge and watched the sun come over the mountains, and had written about it in the kind of language that made the thing real and present, the light on the grass, the sound of the cattle settling, the smell of the morning. And at the end of the entry, a single line: "Gideon came with me this morning and said not a word the whole ride, and that pleased me more than I could explain. He is learning to listen to the land. I think he will be all right." Gideon's voice had gone slightly rough by the last line. He stopped reading. Maria's eyes were bright. "He knew you," she said softly. "I did not know he had written that," Gideon said. "He watched you just as closely as you watched him," she said, "and what he saw made him certain you would be all right." Gideon set the journal on the table and pressed the backs of his hands against his eyes for a moment. And Maria did the most loving thing she knew how to do, which was to not look away and not pretend she had not seen. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were red but his face was composed, and she looked at him with the full warmth of what she felt and did not hide it. "He was right, by the way," she said. "You are all right." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more complicated. "He would have liked you," he said. "You say what you mean." "I learned that from my mother," she said. "She said the biggest waste of time in the world was saying things you didn't mean to spare feelings that didn't need sparing." He smiled, a real, full, warm smile. He reached across the table and took her hand, and this time she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and he held on. They spent 2 more hours with the chest that evening, going through things carefully. There were 14 journals spanning 30 years of Thomas Granger's life, from his first years in the territory as a young man through the last winter before he died. There were packets of letters tied with string, the correspondence with the Philadelphia professor, warm and intellectual and full of the exchange of ideas, and the letters from the Mexican surveyor named Alejandro, who wrote in a mixture of Spanish and English that spoke of years of trust and friendship. And there were letters from people in Tennessee, from Thomas's brothers and his sister, family letters full of news and affection. There were the land documents, the original claim papers and the correspondence with the Territorial Land Office and the long, careful letters Thomas had written to the grant commissioners arguing his case. And at the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, there was a daguerreotype, a small, slightly faded image of a man and a woman and a young boy of perhaps 7 or 8, standing in front of what was clearly the Cimarron ranch house. The man was tall with dark hair and a direct gaze that Gideon had inherited without knowing it, and the woman was small and smiling, and the boy was looking at something off to the side, caught in the act of looking away from whatever he was supposed to be looking at. Gideon held it for a long time without speaking. "That's me," he said finally, pointing to the boy. "Looking at a hawk, I think. There was a hawk that nested in the cottonwood near the house. I was obsessed with it for that whole summer." "You look like him," Maria said. "Your father. Everyone says so," he said. But he was smiling at the daguerreotype, and it was a different smile from any she had seen before, soft and private and full of something tender. He set it on the table beside the journals. "Thank you," he said, looking at her, "for what she said. For asking," he said, "the right way, for not pushing and not making it, for making it feel safe enough." She felt warmth move through her chest. "Your father kept 10 years of himself in that chest for you," she said. "I just thought he deserved to come out." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did what he had been working toward for weeks, which was to lean across the table and kiss her gently, with intention, with the deliberateness of a man who does not do things without meaning them. She kissed him back, her hand still in his, the old journals and letters around them and the cedar smell of the open chest in the air, and it was exactly right. The rest of the summer passed with the sweetness of something that knows it is good. They were together most evenings, and people in Cimarron took note with the quiet satisfaction of a community that likes to see good things happen to people who deserve them. Clara, who did not hide her approval, made a point of baking an extra pie whenever Maria mentioned spending the evening with Gideon, which was often enough that Clara's pie output increased notably. Gideon read through his father's journals in the evenings, sometimes alone and sometimes with Maria, and he found what she had promised he would find, not an end, but an ongoing conversation. His father's voice in those pages was vivid and alive, and full of exactly the particular intelligence and warmth that Gideon remembered, and the reading of them was grief, yes, but it was also something richer: recovery, discovery, the specific gift of realizing that the person you loved has left you more than you knew. He found in the journals that his father had worried about the land grant dispute with a clear-eyed understanding of its injustice, that the grant commissioners were acting in the interests of large eastern land interests against the settled ranchers and farmers of the valley, and that the law as applied was not fair. Thomas Granger had written extensively about this, and what he had written was precise and morally serious and angry in the way of a just man confronting an unjust system. Gideon read those sections with a complicated feeling, pride in his father's clarity, anger on behalf of the valley's people who had suffered the same thing, and a quiet understanding that the loss of the ranch had not been something Thomas could have prevented, which was something Gideon had needed to know for a long time. There was a night in late August when he told Maria about that, about the weight he had been carrying, the feeling that the ranch's loss was somehow his failure, as if a 19-year-old boy should have been able to do what a brilliant, experienced man had not been able to do in time. He sat across from her in the livery room with the journals open on the table, and he said it plainly, and she listened with her whole body, her chin resting on her hand and her eyes steady and clear. When he was done, she said, "You were 19 years old, Gideon, and the system that took your family's land was not just, you know that." "I know it now," he said. "I knew it then in my head. I just felt it differently in my gut." "That's because you loved the land the way your father did," she said. "That's not failure. That's how you know something mattered." He looked at her and she looked back, and he thought, "I am going to marry this woman." The thought arrived with the calm certainty of something that has always been true and has simply been waiting to be spoken internally, and he did not say it that evening, but he held it carefully and warmly and began to understand what it would mean. September brought cooler mornings and the return of the school year in full, and Maria's classroom filled again with its 14 students, now 15 because a new family had arrived from Colorado and brought a son named Joseph who was 11 and very clever. She was busy and contented, and her life in Cimarron had taken on the texture of belonging. She knew everyone on the main street, knew their histories and their concerns, knew which families needed checking on and which children needed extra attention. She was part of the place in a way that felt earned. The water dispute between the Holloways and the Beaumonts had been resolved through the county judge's office in September, with a formal water rights agreement that both families signed, and their children in Maria's classroom were cautiously friendly again, which she counted as a personal victory. Gideon had, over the course of the summer, made several careful decisions. He had written to the Territorial Land Office with a carefully documented claim regarding the original Granger Ranch land, not expecting to recover it, but wanting the record to be clear, using the documents from his father's chest as evidence. He had also framed the daguerreotype and hung it on the wall of his room, and he had organized the journals chronologically on his bookshelf, and he had answered his father's Tennessee sister's last letter, a letter that was now 12 years old, unanswered all this time with an honesty and warmth that he knew Thomas Granger would have approved of. He had also talked to Clara in early September. Clara, who was not one for unnecessary ceremony, had said yes immediately when he asked for her blessing to court Maria formally, and then had said, "Gideon, you have been courting Maria Shelton since May. You are asking now because you want to do something more formal and you need someone to tell you it's the right time. It is the right time," he said. "That is a very direct assessment," she said. "Yes, go ask her." He asked Maria on a Saturday afternoon in late September in the foothills above town where they took their Sunday walks, except it was Saturday because he could not wait until Sunday. They were sitting on a flat rock that overlooked the valley, the mountains blue and enormous behind them and the air carrying the first real cold of autumn, and he had brought her wildflowers again, the last of the season, he said, rough mountain asters and goldenrod, and she had taken them with the warm smile she always had for his flowers. He turned to her on the rock and held both her hands in his and said, "I want to ask you something important." She looked at him with steady, warm eyes. "I was not a man who believed in the particular kind of happiness that comes from someone knowing you," he said. "I think I learned to keep everything so far inside that I stopped expecting anyone to want to look. And then you came to Cimarron and looked, and you did not look away when things got difficult to look at, and you asked about my father's chest in a way that made me feel seen rather than examined, and I have been loved by you in a way I did not know I was capable of being loved." He paused. "I am asking you to be my wife." She was already crying, which was not something she usually did readily, but her eyes were bright and spilling, and she was smiling the full, unguarded smile that he had come to think of as the best thing he had ever seen in his life. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Gideon. Yes." He kissed her, there on the rock above the valley, with the autumn mountains around them, and she leaned into him and he held her, and the world was very good. They were married in November of 1878, in the small church at the end of Cimarron's Main Street, on a day that was cold and brilliant, the kind of New Mexico winter day that comes with a sky so blue it seemed painted. Clara stood with Maria and served as witness, and Gideon's cousin James, who was Ellis's father, stood with Gideon. The whole town came, or nearly all of it, the ranchers and the shopkeepers, and the children from the school who had pressed their faces against the church windows, until they were waved inside by Clara, who could not stand to see good clothes being wrinkled against glass. Maria wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself from fabric Clara had ordered specially, and she carried a small bouquet of dried mountain flowers because that was what the season offered, and she thought it more beautiful than anything bought. She walked down the aisle with her hand on Clara's arm because her father could not make the journey from Taos in time, and she walked steadily, and with the clear-eyed certainty of a woman who knows her own mind. Gideon stood at the altar with his hands clasped in front of him, and watched her come toward him with an expression that everyone in that church would remember for years. It was not the careful, guarded look they were used to from him. It was entirely open, wide open, every defense down, love showing plainly on his face the way weather shows on a mountain, too large to hide. The ceremony was conducted by the pastor, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Ellis, no relation to young Ellis Granger, and the words were simple and meant. When Gideon said, "I will," he said it in the direct, deliberate way he said everything that mattered, and Maria said hers with steady eyes looking into his, and the congregation was very quiet in the particular way of people witnessing something they recognize as real. Afterward there was a gathering at the raised dining room, where the family had laid out a supper of remarkable generosity, and there was music from 2 fiddle players and dancing on the swept-clean floor, and people stayed until the cold night air reminded them of the walk home. Clara danced twice and drank a glass of wine, and cried a little and told Gideon he had better take very good care of Maria, to which he said simply and seriously, "I intend to," which Clara said was the correct answer. They settled into a life that had the shape of things built to last. They moved into the room above the livery at first, which was where Gideon had lived, and Maria brought her things from Clara's, her books and her lamp and her journal collection, and the tin cup she had kept the dried flowers in, which she still used, and she arranged them in the room with the naturalness of someone making a space hers, and Gideon watched her do it with the expression of a man who can scarcely believe his luck. The room felt different with the two of them in it, fuller, warmer. The cedar chest sat in its corner still but open now. The lid kept up with a small wooden prop that Gideon had fashioned, and the journals were on the shelf in order, and the daguerreotype was on the wall, and it was clear that Thomas Granger was present in that room not as a weight but as a presence, the good kind, the kind that belongs. They were together through the winter, which was cold and beautiful, and Maria continued teaching, and Gideon continued running the livery, and in the evenings they sat by the stove and read or talked or played cards with Clara on Tuesday nights, which became a standing arrangement. They were happy in the particular way that is not dramatic, not the happiness of constant excitement, but the happiness of deep mutual ease, of knowing that you are with someone who sees you clearly and chooses you exactly as you are. In the early spring of 1879, Maria wrote a letter to her father in Taos. He had sent a wedding gift, a beautifully made wooden box with a letter inside full of warmth and apology for not being able to make the journey, and she had written back immediately. But now she wrote again with more detail, describing Cimarron and the school and her life and her husband. And she ended the letter by saying that she hoped he would come when the weather turned, that she very much wanted him to meet Gideon. Her father came in April, riding up from Taos on a solid roan horse that he had ridden since before Maria was born, or so it seemed. He was a weathered man in his late 50s named Maria Shelton, a farmer who had the particular quality of a man who has worked the land his whole life and found it worth the work, steady, observant, not given to excess words. He reminded Maria, in certain lights, of the Thomas Granger she had learned from the journals. He stayed for a week. Gideon, who had been slightly anxious in the quiet way he was anxious about things, need not have been. Maria Shelton watched Gideon the way a farmer watches weather carefully over time, reading what was beneath the surface, and on the third evening, sitting on the bench outside the livery in the cooling spring air, he said to Gideon, "She is the best person I have ever known. You know that." "I know it," Gideon said. "Good," Robert said, and that was the entirety of the formal assessment, which was enough. He left on a bright April morning and promised to come again at Christmas, and Maria stood in the street watching him ride south with a full heart and Gideon's hand warm in hers. Spring brought growth in every sense. The school enrollment grew to 18 students, and the school committee approved a new room to be added to the schoolhouse, which Gideon helped build on Saturdays through April and May, working alongside 3 other men with the focused pleasure of construction. The livery business had grown steady and reliable, with several of the larger ranches keeping their spare horses there on contract, and Gideon hired a young man named Tom Prentice, who was 17 and good with animals, as a stable hand, giving himself slightly more evenings free. In May, Maria told Gideon she was expecting. She told him at supper simply, watching his face. He set down his fork. He looked at her. And then very slowly his face did what she had watched it do only a handful of times, completely opened, all of it visible, every feeling right at the surface, and what was there was joy. Pure, deep, slightly overwhelmed joy. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands and pressed them against his face, and she laughed at that, a warm, bright laugh, and brought her hands up to cup his face and looked at him. "A family," he said. "A family," she agreed. He held her that night, long after she had fallen asleep, lying awake in the good dark with his hand resting gently on her and thinking about his father, about Thomas Granger, who had done this same thing, held his wife in the dark of the ranch house and thought about what they were building, who had written in his journal about the astonishment of expectation, the sacred weight of it. He had found that entry a month after he opened the chest, and it had made him cry for the first time in years, and now he thought about it in the warm dark and it made him feel accompanied in the very best way. He thought, "I will read him the journals, or her. I will read them to whoever this is when they are old enough so they can know their grandfather." He fell asleep with that thought and slept better than he had in 10 years. The summer of 1879 was full and warm and busy. Maria taught through June and made arrangements for the fall term with the new assistant teacher. The committee had hired a young woman named Frances who was 22 and capable, and who Maria immediately liked and took under her wing with the particular generosity of a teacher who does not hoard her methods. They prepared the new classroom together and organized the school supplies and planned the fall curriculum in the long summer evenings, and Maria felt the school becoming something more than it had been when she arrived. Gideon built things. He had always been a builder in the practical sense, but something in his father's journals had stirred a different kind of building impulse, and he began planning the expansion of the livery in the old way. Carefully, with measurements and materials lists, the way Thomas had planned things on the ranch. He bought the lot next to the livery and began laying the foundation for a house. A real house, larger than the room above the stable, with a kitchen and a parlor and 2 bedrooms and a porch that faced the mountains. He worked on it evenings and Saturdays with the help of James Granger and Tom Prentice and any other willing hands who could be enlisted, and it took shape through the summer with the gradual inevitability of something built with care. Maria came by each evening to see the progress, standing in what would be the kitchen and imagining it, standing in the parlor space and thinking of where the books would go. "This room," Gideon said one evening, walking her through the framed rooms with the late sun making everything gold, "is for the chest." She stopped. "I want it in the main room," he said. "Not in a corner, in a place where it belongs, where Thomas can be part of the house." She looked at him for a long moment and felt something move in her chest that was almost too large to hold. She stepped to him and put her arms around him, and he held her in the half-built house with the mountains visible through the empty window frames and the smell of new wood around them. "He would be so proud of you," she said against his shoulder. "I think he would have been proud before," Gideon said quietly. "I just couldn't hear him saying it until I opened the chest." She understood that completely. She held him tighter. Their son was born in January of 1880, which was a winter that came down hard and cold over the Cimarron Valley. The birth was attended by Clara and by the town's doctor, and by the older women of the community who knew things about births that no medical textbook contained. And it was long and difficult in the way that first births often are. And Maria was strong in the way she was strong about everything, with a concentrated, deliberate focus, accepting help without embarrassment, and asking for what she needed clearly. Gideon sat in the downstairs room of their new house. They had moved in October and held the cedar chest's small key in his fist until his palm was marked with its shape. And when the cry came from upstairs, he stood so fast he knocked his chair back. And by the time Clara called him up, he was already at the foot of the stairs. The baby was a boy. Red-faced and furious about the world, as newly born babies are, with dark hair and enormous dark eyes that already seemed, even at minutes old, to be paying close attention to everything. Maria held him against her with the slightly stunned expression of someone who has just done something remarkable and knows it, and she looked up at Gideon, who was standing in the doorway of the bedroom looking at them both with that wide-open face she loved. "Come and meet him," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the careful hands of a man who knows how to hold things that matter, not too tight, not too loose, with the steadiness of someone who intends to be here, who intends to stay. "Thomas," he said. It was not a question. "Thomas," she agreed. "Thomas Robert Granger," he said, to include her father, and she pressed her lips together and nodded. And Clara, standing at the foot of the bed, said, "That is a very fine name," in a voice that suggested she was not entirely unmoved. Little Thomas Granger arrived in the world with his grandfather's name and his father's dark eyes, and it became clear as the weeks passed, his mother's particular habit of paying extremely close attention to everything around him. He was a serious infant in the best sense, attentive, watchful, responsive to voices, calmed by the sound of reading, which Gideon discovered by accident one night when he picked up one of his father's journals while holding the fussing baby and began to read aloud, and the baby quieted immediately and looked up at him with enormous eyes. "See," Maria said from the doorway, sleepy and smiling. "He knows his grandfather's voice through you." Gideon looked at his son and then at his wife, and thought that there were things in life that you could not have imagined when you were a grieving 19-year-old boy watching everything you knew fall away, and that perhaps that was the point. You had to go through the years in between, all of them, even the hard ones, even the ones where you sat by a locked chest and could not bring yourself to open it, in order to arrive at the place where things made sense. He read to Thomas Robert Granger from his grandfather's journals in those early months, the baby in his arms and Maria nearby, and the words of Thomas Granger Sr. moved through the warm air of the new house like something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to be spoken aloud. And sometimes Maria would listen from her chair with her mending in her lap and her eyes soft, and sometimes she would ask Gideon to read a particular passage again because she wanted to hear it twice, and he always did. The years that followed were good years. Not perfect, no years in the New Mexico territory in that time were perfect, and there were droughts and disputes, and the particular difficulties of building a life in a place that was still finding its own shape. The territory was changing, the railroad coming through in ways that changed the economy and the character of the land and the town, and Maria and Gideon navigated those changes with the steadiness of people who have built something solid together. Thomas grew into a boy with his father's quietness and his mother's directness and his grandfather's love of observation, and he took to reading early and took to horses even earlier, and he spent hours in the livery beside his father learning the names and natures of every animal there, and hours in the schoolhouse beside his mother learning everything else. He was not the last child. In the spring of 1882, Maria delivered a daughter, who they named Eleanor Ruth, the Ruth for James Granger's wife who had been a steady friend through the years, and Eleanor came into the world decisive and loud and made her preferences known from her first hour, which pleased everyone. Gideon's letter to the Territorial Land Office, which he had sent in late 1878, had generated a slow-moving response that worked its way through the bureaucratic channels of the territory over several years. He had not expected resolution. But in the spring of 1883, a letter arrived from the territorial governor's office acknowledging the documented injustice of the original land grant proceedings and offering a formal record correction, not the land back, which was not possible after 15 years of subsequent ownership, but a correction of the legal record that cleared the Granger name from the debt judgment that had followed the ranch's loss. He read the letter at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning before Maria came downstairs, and by the time she appeared, Thomas behind her, Eleanor on her hip, he was sitting with the letter flat on the table and his hand over it and an expression she knew well, the wide open one. She set Eleanor down carefully and came to the table, and he handed her the letter. She read it. She looked at him. "It's what he deserved," Gideon said. "What should have been done years ago." "Yes," she said. She sat down across from him and reached across and covered his hand with hers, the way she had that first evening with the chest open between them. "We should write and tell your Tennessee family," she said. "Your father's sister, she should know." He nodded. "I'll write tonight. And I'll write a record of it in the front of his first journal," Maria said, "so it's there, so Thomas can read it someday." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light with the two children in the background and the new house around them, and the cedar chest visible through the open parlor door, sitting exactly where he had said it would sit, not in a corner in a place of honor, lid open, the journals and letters within it arranged and cared for, and he thought about what it meant to be seen by someone, truly seen, all of it, the closed places and the open ones. The grief and the love and the things you could not speak until someone asked in the right way. He had not opened his father's chest in a decade. She had asked about it gently, and he had told her everything. And everything had followed from that, the grief addressed, the love recovered, the life built. "Come here," he said. She came around the table and he pulled her into his lap, which made her laugh, and Eleanor clapped at this development. And Thomas said with great dignity that he was going to go feed the horses, which at 7 years old he was fully capable of doing. And Gideon held his wife in the morning kitchen light and pressed his face into her dark hair, and she put her arms around him, and they held on to each other with the ease of 5 years of doing it and the certainty of many more years ahead. "I love you," he said into her hair. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, simply, directly, without ornamentation, with his whole self behind it. "I love you," she said, "and I love Thomas, your father, through his words and through you." "He would have loved you back," Gideon said, "very much." She pressed closer against him. "Then we have an agreement across time," she said, "all three of us." He laughed, the good low real laugh, and held her tighter. Outside, in the Cimarron morning, the mountains were already going gold in the early light, and the livery horses were starting up their morning sounds, and somewhere down the street Clara Bridwell was opening her store with the same efficiency she had applied to 30 years of mornings. and the whole town was waking to another ordinary beautiful day in the New Mexico territory. The kind of day that Thomas Granger Sr. had written about with such careful love in the journals that sat open in the parlor chest. The kind of day that a man could build a life around if he was paying attention, and if he was lucky enough to find someone who would ask about the things that mattered and stay close enough to hear the answer. Thomas Granger Jr. came back in from the livery with hay in his hair, looking exactly like both of his parents in a way that was its own kind of miracle, and a leaner had gotten into the cornmeal bag, which was not miraculous but was very on brand for a leaner, and Gideon released Maria with a resigned laugh and stood to deal with the cornmeal situation, and Maria wiped her eyes and stood and smoothed her dress and went to start the oatmeal, and the morning continued in all its full, imperfect, beloved particularity. That evening, after the children were asleep, they sat together in the parlor with the lamp turned low, Gideon with the last of his father's journals open in his hands and Maria reading beside him. He read a passage to her from an entry Thomas had written in 1863, a passage about hope, about what it meant to build something in a place that was raw and unfinished, about how the act of building was itself an assertion of belief in the future. He read it twice, because Maria asked him to. Then he set the journal carefully back in the chest and looked at the daguerreotype on the wall, the tall man with the direct gaze, the smiling woman, the boy looking at a hawk he could not bring himself to stop watching, and he felt nothing of the old weight, the old locked grief. Only presence, only gratitude, only the warm conviction that his father's life had not been diminished by ending, but continued in the people who carried it forward, in the journals that had been waiting patiently to be read, in the son named Thomas, who was already showing signs of the same deep patient love for the land and the world that had defined his grandfather. Ready to come to bed, Maria said, touching his arm. Yes, he said. He stood and stretched and reached for the lamp. He paused before turning it down and looked at the chest one more time, open, aired out, tended to. Not a closed door but a living room, the kind where good things were kept and referred to and passed on. He turned down the lamp and took his wife's hand and walked with her up the stairs of the house he had built and into the room where they had made their life. And the cedar chest sat downstairs in the dark, and the mountains stood outside, and the stars were extraordinary over Cimarron, and everything was exactly what it should be. In the years that followed, Maria Shelton Granger became known as the finest teacher in the Cimarron Valley, whose students went on to universities and to other professions and to lives of their own making, and several of them, decades later, would say that she was the one who taught them to pay attention, to ask questions, to understand that the things people kept locked away were often the things they most needed to share. Gideon Granger became known as a man of uncommon honesty and steadiness, a man whose word meant something absolutely, and who built his business and his family with the same careful intention with which his father had built his ranch. Thomas Robert Granger grew up to be a surveyor, which surprised no one who had watched him study maps as a child, and Alina Ruth Granger grew up to study medicine, which surprised everyone and delighted her mother completely. Both of them grew up knowing their grandfather, not the living man whom they had not known, but the man of the journals, the man of the letters, the man whose handwriting they could identify by the time they were 10 years old, whose voice came through the pages of those carefully kept books with such clarity that he seemed present. The cedar chest was, for all of their childhood and beyond, the heart of the house, not just a storage place but a living archive, a testimony to the fact that a life carefully lived and carefully recorded continues beyond the person who lived it, that love does not end with the body, that opening the things you have kept closed when the time and the person are right is not the end of something but the beginning of something larger. Maria had asked gently, and Gideon had told her everything. And in the telling, they had found not just each other but the full inheritance of a life, his father's life and theirs, and the lives of the children who would come after, growing up under the New Mexico sky in a house where every room contained something worth paying attention to, where the windows faced the mountains, where the books were on the shelves and the journals were in the chest, and the chest was always open. The mountains stood as they had always stood, blue and enormous and patient, and the valley below them held the lives of people trying to build something that would last. And two of those people had found each other in the way that matters most slowly, honestly, with attentiveness and gentleness, opening the locked things between them with care, and discovering that what was inside was not just grief and loss, but everything worth keeping, everything worth passing on, everything that made a life into a legacy and a house into a home, and they were happy. In all the ordinary, accumulated, real ways that happiness actually exists, in the mornings and the evenings, in the reading and the work and the supper table, in the sound of children in the house and the horses in the livery and the mountains through every window, they were genuinely, completely, enduringly happy, which was everything.